I bet in your own applications you've seen this error once or twice where Meteor complains that your code always has to be run inside of a fiber, and the suggested action is to use this bindEnvironment function to fix the problem. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to show you why you get this error from time to time and how we can fix it. On the left is some code that should be familiar. We're still using this environment variable that we created last time called name. And down below, I've created two fibers, and in each one, we run it immediately. And then we set this dynamic variable name to different values in each fiber and then call the handle request function. Inside there, I'm grabbing a reference to the current fiber so we can see it in the debugger, and then we'll print out the value of the current name, and we'll say that we're handling the request. So over in the debugger, let's take a look at the current fiber, and you can see that Meteor Dynamics has been added as a property to the fiber, and we see the current value of the environment variable, their dynamic variable, is Ann. So if I were to continue running the debugger here, and you look down at the bottom, you'll see that both requests have been handled, and it prints out the proper name for each one. Now let's try to break this, and the way that we can do that is that inside of the handle request function, I want to run some code outside of this fiber at a later time. Well, we know from learning about asynchronous code that the easiest way to add something to run at a later time in JavaScript is to use the setTimeout function. So this will put this function back on the task queue at a time that we specify. So I'll say 2 seconds later. And at that point, we want to print out to the console the value of the name again, and we'll just say that we've handled the request, or that we've finished the request. So at this point, this code is going to execute outside of the fiber that we created here, and I'm going to show you that in the debugger. So let me get rid of the debug statement here, and instead we'll grab a reference to the current fiber here, and I'll put a debugger so that it drops us over on the right. So now let's refresh the node inspector, and we should be now inside of this setTimeout. Okay, now this is 2 seconds later, so if you look down at the bottom, we've handled both requests for Chris and for Ann, and inside of the timeout, take a look at the current fiber. It's set to undefined. And the reason for that is because when we run this function, setTimeout gets set right away, but then the function returns and this fiber is finished running. And so when this function runs, there's no concept of that original fiber. This is a new function that's running at a later time from the task queue. So we can see inside of this setTimeout function, the current fiber is undefined, and it's undefined because we haven't created a new one yet. So if we keep stepping through this, what will happen when we get to the name.get call, I'll step us into the actual implementation of that so you can see. We're inside the implementation of that get function, and so we're getting the value of the environment variable name. And what you can see here is that it grabs the value from this Meteor Dynamics property that's set on the current fiber. So if there is no current fiber, then this piece of code wouldn't work. We'd get an undefined exception from JavaScript. So what Meteor does is first it calls this node code must be run in fiber function, and that just checks whether or not there's a current fiber. And if there isn't one, then it'll throw this exception that you've probably seen a bunch of times. So if we step through this code and we just press play, you'll see the ugly error that gets thrown down at the bottom in the server console. And here's the error, and when I first saw this, it seems like what we should be doing is just running this callback code inside of a fiber. So let's try that. We could go ahead and create a new fiber, and then the fiber would exist, and hopefully this error will go away. To save some time, I put in some code inside of the setTimeout function. I just created a new fiber and run it immediately. And inside that, now I call the get function of our name dynamic variable, and we say finished request. And I've dropped us into the debugger so we can take a look. So now we do have a fiber defined, and we can check that out in the debug area here in the watch expression. You can see we have a fiber. But if we continue down to this function and press play, notice that what happens is the value of name is undefined. So for both requests, the name value is undefined. And inside of this fiber, the value for name is not available. The reason for that is because we created a new fiber here, but we didn't copy over those dynamic variables to the fiber itself. And so those dynamic variables were available on this fiber at this time, but at this later time, there's nothing to tell Meteor that these variables should now be copied over to this new fiber. So at least we made the error go away by running this code inside of a fiber, but now we want to make sure that the value of the name environment variable inside of this function is correct. So to do that, we can use the function called bindEnvironment. And what that does is it wraps a function, so we can call it like this, bindEnvironment. And what it will do is automatically save the values of any dynamic environment variables at the time that this was called and return a new function. And that new function will automatically create a fiber if one hasn't been created yet automatically. And then it will copy over the values of those dynamic variables to the new fiber so that they're available. So when I save this and it drops us back in the debugger, we can take a look and make sure that that's true. All right, in the debugger, you can see that there is a fiber defined, so that was created for us automatically by this bindEnvironment wrapper. And the Meteor Dynamics variables have been copied over, and so name.get should return the proper name for this fiber. So if we press play, we can make sure that that's true. And if I bring back the server console for a second, you can see that both names were set properly. You can find the bindEnvironment function over in the Meteor core in the Meteor package, and it's in the Dynamics Node.js file. You can study this yourself, but a couple of highlights that I'd like to point out is you can see how it's returning a new function that just wraps the one that we passed in, and it makes sure that if there isn't a current fiber, it creates a new one and runs our code with it. And then up here, you can see how it is saving the current dynamic variables and then setting them back before calling our function.